Hi everyone. This is a very improvised kind of video. I'm not doing an essay reading like I did in my last video. This is more like a rambling kind of thing where I was reading Jacques Lacan's Écrits, I think it's called, but in particular the passages on the mirror stage and the Freudian thing. So I'm armed with my coffee and oh god, that's hot. I'm armed with my coffee, and um, as I was like reading it, I was thinking a lot about cinema and uh, also the idea of time and the ego, the formation of the ego, and something that I noticed one writer was talking about was the formation of the ego through time. Um, but I also related it to film. I was thinking about different subcultures. There's this subculture on the internet of people who really love the Blade Runner movies. And I know it's going to sound weird, but like a lot of people, they have really attached themselves to Ryan Gosling's character in Blade Runner 2049. And there is a running gag on these sort of subgroups that Ryan Gosling is just like them in the movie. And I'm going to explain how that is both true but also not true. Um so I don't know, this is a sort of rambling thing. In the beginning, I'm just going to explain what is the mirror stage, what is the ego, and how that is formed and relates to cinema, and then answer that yes, you are just like Ryan Gosling in Blade Runner 2049. But then I'm going to argue against that in my own ideas and say perhaps you aren't actually exactly like Ryan Gosling due to the distinction between humans and objects, or humans and film characters. So, the basic premise of Lacan's mirror stage that I'm going to explain without looking at notes because I'm a madman and I've just been thinking about this so much. But basically, the ego is like your consciousness. Duh. It's the thing that you can refer to as like I. It's what you are. It's like your thoughts. It's you technically. This body is just kind of like a meat sack that is holding this metaphysical thing that formulates, that forms throughout your life. But Lacan talks about the first creation of the ego, um, and he describes it as this moment called the mirror stage, where when you are a child, you first see yourself in the mirror. Um, and it's like that's the formation of the ego. That's the moment you realize that you are both yourself, but also like an external object. Um, and he said that that's it. That's when the ego is created. But then later on, in later publishings, he said he realized actually no, you need um, a parent to be the one who holds you up to the mirror and points to it and says, that is you. That is you. And so then you are created. You as the ego is created. It's a very trippy process. And he says that parental figures throughout your life slowly form your ego and shape it into your personality that you are. And so when you watch a movie, for instance, and like, well, yeah, so your parents, you will attribute traits from your parents over time. So you are technically your parents. He uses this analogy of the desk in his lectures because that's the first thing he finds. Like he's just like, oh, let's look around. What can I use as an example? I'll use this desk, And so he says that when, like he's saying that the desk, he gives the desk an ego, for instance. He gives it an ego. But then he says there is actually no ego of the desk. It's just my ego that I have transplanted into it. And that, I think, is a similar process to what happens with children, where the parent's ego just gets put into the child during the mirror stage and throughout their life. So you are not yourself, you are actually your parents, and your parents were their parents, and their parents were their parents. It's a very strange thing. And the same process happens with... And your parents aren't the only thing that forms your ego, though, because cinema can form your ego. When you watch a movie and you learn from the lessons, that is helping shape your personality and attributes. And also, when you watch a movie, it is also like a mirror. So you see yourself in the main character. And that is why Ryan Gosling in Blade Runner 2049 is technically just like you, or just like me, or whatever, because it is helping form you and your ego, but it is also you seeing yourself in that figure and planting your ego inside of it. Like when I am looking at like my desk or something and I put my ego into it, the desk doesn't then have its own ego. I just put my own ego into it. So when you watch Blade Runner 2049, you just put your own ego into it and then see yourself in that. And then that's why it's just like you as well. So it's kind of this cycle where it's like feeding into you, but you're also feeding into it. So yes, Ryan Gosling in Blade Runner 2049 is just like you. And here's the distinction that I'm going to be making right now. And it is the process of time that I find interesting, that I don't know if Lacan really went too much into it, but it's something that I picked up on, where this sort of process where Lacan puts his ego into the desk, he describes it as unconscious. He describes it as unconscious. And I'm going to actually start reading from these notes that I wrote up. Okay, so I actually did write up this section of this thing. It just had required an understanding of the Lacanian ego and stuff. Okay, so I say... In Lacan's analogy, he describes how he has lent his voice to the desk so that it might speak of its existence, where the consciousness belongs not to the desk but to ourselves. Taking this into account, his theories on the mirror stage, Lacan has in this moment formed the ego of the desk, but this ego does not belong to the object but himself. In regards to humans, however, it is not an instantaneous, unconscious action. Rather, the ego of the child develops over time. But how does one express this formulated ego? With the desk, the ego seems to emerge fully formed in an instant, but the only person able to describe the ego of the desk is Lacan himself, who has given his ego to it. Parents, on the other hand, cannot say with absolute confidence that the child has a fully conscious ego upon exposing them to the mirror, nor the other myriad of moments throughout their life where they slowly dispense knowledge, behaviors, and personality traits. So what I'm calling into question here is the process of the time that it takes for the ego to form. With the desk, it forms instantaneously, but with the child, it develops over time, and humans, like, they're different. But I'm trying to get to the process now of what distinguishes the temporality and the formulation of the ego of the objects in humans, what distinguishes humans from objects, and thus what distinguishes humans from movie characters. Okay, where was I? Personality traits. With the human being, it takes time for the ego to take shape, whereas the full ego of the desk is formed in no time at all. However, with the human, It requires that the child acknowledges through their own speech that they have fully formed their ego. With the desk, the speaker, Lacan, can speak for the desk to say their ego is formed. With children, while the parents can do a mock voice of their children where the baby essentially becomes a puppet of the adults, or point to the child in the mirror and say, "This is you," the ego cannot be confidently said to be formed yet. It requires then that over time the child is able to come to understand their ego and consciousness and acknowledge themselves and express through speech their formed ego. This in-between process of formation could take 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, or even never. And this in-between time, I will refer to what Colette Sola discusses in Time and Interpretation from, and this is the long title of a book, Reading Seminars 1 and 2, Lacan's Return to Freud, Seminar 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, Seminar 2, The Ego in Freud's Theory and the Technique of Psychoanalysis. In her essay, Sola describes the temporality of the subject as neither clock time nor the temporality of living beings. It is the temporality of the signifier. She goes on to expand what she means by describing it as a twofold temporality between anticipation and retroaction. It is what Lacan called reversible time. Continuing on, she explains that it is the time split between "I don't know yet" and "oh yes, I already knew that," where the ego slowly forms and recognizes itself, but it requires not only the formative speech of others to help explain it, but the subject themselves to eventually acknowledge what they already knew. In this sense, the formulation of the subject's ego begins at the moment they see themselves in the mirror, and the moment they finally acknowledge their own ego in speech and language. The written word then becomes a powerful tool for authors and the individual to help acknowledge their own ego. It is what I believe ultimately distinguishes us from objects like a desk. Our ability for speech and the desk's inability of speech, requiring someone like Lacan to speak for it, is the definitive division between humans and objects. So relating it back to movies now, to our Ryan Gosling, he's just like me sort of analogy, he isn't just like me, because my ego formulates over time, and what distinguishes me from Ryan Gosling though is my ability through speech to acknowledge my own ego. Ryan Gosling in Blade Runner 2049 does not acknowledge his own ego and cannot acknowledge the ego that I have placed within him, because there's that kind of separation of the screen, and he's just a movie character, and in essence an object that I put things into. So Ryan Gosling in Blade Runner 2049 is both just like me, just like you, just like us, but also not like us, because he is a mere object who cannot acknowledge their own ego through speech. Only I am able to acknowledge my own formulated ego. I am only able to say, yes, I have a fully formed ego. Anyway, these are just some random ramblings and thoughts that have been swirling around in my head while locked up in isolation. Let me know if you agree, if you don't agree, what your thoughts are. If you think that my understanding on Lacan is limited, that would be awesome to hear, because I don't feel like I fully know Lacan that much. Anyway, yeah, let me know what you think.